I would like to present something on the aftermath of terrorist attacks. So let's see if this works. Yes. So what I would like to do is, first of all, emphasize why it is important to look at the aftermath or responses to terrorism. Then I will zoom in on the concept of meaning making, which is the key concept that I used in my research, and explain how I operationalized the term, and then say something about the main findings of my research and also some of the more policy-related implications that it has. So to start with something that is probably very familiar to many of you, already from the 1970s onwards, we know that terrorism is not just about killing. It's about the impact, it's about an audience that is watching, or as Brian Jenkins said, it's a form of theater. It's symbolic. It's maybe also, you could say, a form of violent communication. So terrorists use attacks to send a message. So it's kind of a process, an action-reaction process that starts with the attack, but the actual impact is mostly determined also by how we respond to it as societies and how authorities respond to it. So if we take that as a starting point, so terrorism is not just about killing, it's about these audiences, it's about responses, then we know that we should also more strongly focus on studying these responses. And I noticed that in the field of terrorism studies in general, we pay a lot of attention, rightly so, of course, to who the terrorists are, how we can stop them, but we do not focus so much on what happens afterwards. So this is what I was used as a starting point for my research. And then what I did in my book is look at how societies responded to terrorist attacks. And I focused, as I said, on this concept of meaning making. Well, meaning making is a concept that is used across many disciplines, ranging from psychology, sociology, cultural anthropology, and so on, but it's also a very key concept in the field of crisis management. And this is also linked to the work of, for instance, Arjen Boyn and Paul Hart, who said leaders face a number of different tasks after any type of crisis. So terrorist attack is one example, but it could also be a natural disaster, so different types of crises. But they say this meaning making is one of the key tasks. So it first of all starts, of course, with sense making. So getting the facts straight, really know what is going on. Do we need to close off the airspace, for instance, if it's a really massive incident? So you see, based on how you assess the situation, you take certain decisions, of course. But what I focus on is not this initial phase or this initial response of getting the facts straight, but more the broader perspective that actors put it in. So I think the most famous example that we all know is Bush after 9/11. He asked the question, why do they hate us? This is clearly a question of meaning making. So why do they do this? Why do they hate us? Well, his answer was they hate our liberal values, they hate our democracy, our pluralism, and so on. So this is one way to put it in a broader framework. So, for instance, a context of war. But you could also frame it as a one-off incident or maybe a deranged individual. So there's different interpretations. And these interpretations, in turn, of course, also affect the decisions that you will make. Well, I focused on this meaning-making phase, both by authorities, but also by citizens. And here I tried to bring sociology and cultural anthropology back into the mix to also look at rituals and symbols. So I looked at frames, so what people say, and kind of the narrative frameworks, but also what they do in terms of rituals, demonstrations, commemorations, and so on. And I did this for 4 different attacks. 4 IS-related jihadist attacks that were perpetrated all around 2016, 2017. So I chose 4 attacks with a similar ideological background, a similar geography in terms of like Western Europe, and around the same time to at least make them somewhat comparable. Of course, you can never compare incidents, right? They're of course all very different, but I chose 4 that are somewhat related, you could say. So I looked at the attacks in Brussels in 2016, on the metro and the airport in Zaventem, where more than 30 people were killed. I looked at the attack in Nice on the boulevard on 14 Juillet, so the main national French holiday, where people had just finished watching the fireworks. Berlin, the attack on the Christmas market, next to the Gedächtniskirche, so one of the main churches in Berlin. And in Manchester, on the concert of Ariana Grande, maybe you remember this, that also a lot of young children in particular were targeted. So that was seen as somehow even more brutal or horrific than the other ones. So those are the 4 cases that I studied. And well, I looked at, well, maybe I should say first, I looked at the first year after an attack. So I zoomed in on 3 different periods. So the first day, so really the first 24 hours, which is also more the kind of the crisis management angle. Then the first week, because that's usually when most of the frames and meaning-making process gets distilled into a certain form, you could say. And then I fast-forwarded to 1 year later to look at, in particular, at the first anniversary of the attacks, to see, okay, how do societies commemorate it? What symbols do they use? Who is on stage? Who is not on stage? How political is it? And now I'm trying to simplify, which is what is 5 years of research into one slide, which I somehow managed. But of course, I have to make the remark here that this is, of course, a simplification. There's many other sides to it, but I think you could overall say that all the cases had certain patterns. And if you want to read more details, you can have it on my final slide. I have a QR code that you can stay up. Yeah, it's very modern, right? Yeah. That you can stay updated about the book, because this will be hopefully published early next year in a book with Oxford. But the simplified version is that in Brussels, the attacks were really framed as part of a broader European trend. So there was really this European threat of jihadism. This was in March 2016, so a few months after the November Paris attacks, right? The Bataclan attacks, where also the perpetrators had fled to Belgium. So it was really branded as, this is not a Belgian problem, this is a European problem. And it was really, as Charles Michel, the Prime Minister, said, it was no surprise that this would happen. The only question was when it would happen. Huh? So they knew it was coming, the only question was when. So very much a European threat. Second element was that quite immediately after the attack, blame games erupted between the different authorities also in the country. And this had to do in particular with a march against fear that was planned. So citizens decided, like, we want to stand up against terror. We're going to plan a march against fear on Easter Sunday. But then a few days before that march was actually taking place, the authorities kind of ironically had to cancel the march against fear out of fear of another attack. Which was probably the smartest decision they could take in terms of threat assessment, but in terms of what it looked like and kind of the emotion that it stirred in the population, it wasn't so great, because then hooligans from Flanders decided to say we're still standing up against terror, so they marched to the Beursplein, one of the main squares in Brussels, and kind of destroyed the memorial, or not on purpose, but they trampled it, and it was all destroyed afterwards. So there was a lot of tension between Flanders and Brussels, that Flanders had come with its right-wing extremists to destroy Brussels and so on. So quite quickly, blame games between the different authorities. In Nice, in France, the situation was very different. So here it wasn't framed as a European attack, it was really framed as a French problem, because France was engaged in this civilizational battle with Islam and jihadism in particular. Jihadists who hated the liberté, égalité, fraternité of French society. So they didn't even mention the attacks in Brussels, even though this was July 2016 and the attacks in Brussels had happened a few months before. It was quite interesting that there was no reference at all to the fact that it was only a few months before that another major European country had been targeted by attacks. So really a French problem, it was seen. And really in the context of a war. So directly President Hollande announced to intensify strikes against IS in Syria and Iraq, so a war frame. And also a lot of discussions about the security situation. So in particular, how many police officers were present on the boulevard to protect the crowds. There was a lot of fighting about this, different numbers being shared, people calling the Minister of Interior a liar. He then responded in the middle of the night with a communique calling other people a liar. So directly you see these blame games emerging about the protection. The case of Berlin was, again, very different. So here the main theme, you could say, was Berlin unimpressed. So Berlin, a city that also has a history of violence, of course, in the Second World War. So they said, we're not going to be disturbed by some jihadists. Of course, they really were very sad and angry about the attacks, but the common frame was, no, we're not going to be very impressed by this. We're just going to continue daily life. But interestingly, here also the authorities really admitted some guilt, you could say, or even accepted that they were, to some extent, to blame for the attacks. They literally apologized a year later also for not being able to prevent it. And that's quite special, because you rarely see authorities really accepting the fact that they, or saying that they could have prevented the attacks. So this was really a clear case of blame acceptance. And then the case of Manchester, again, very different, maybe to some extent related to Berlin, that you could say not very impressed, but here they tried to spin it more positively and really emphasize the resilience of the city itself. And also, for instance, the song Don't Look Back in Anger by Oasis really became a core theme for citizen authorities to show we're not going to be polarized, we're not going to be divided, we're going to stick together, and we want to show solidarity. Well, this was also the only case where there was a debate at all between the link between foreign policy and terrorism, because this is the thing you see, of course, in all the claims by IS. They always say this is a response to the military interventions of the West in Iraq, Syria, and so on. And only in the case of Manchester there was any debate. In this case, it was launched by Jeremy Corbyn, who was then completely destroyed for doing so because it was seen as unacceptable to launch that debate at that moment. But he was the only one who tried to raise the debate. Maybe the UK shouldn't be so much involved in military operations abroad. I'm not passing judgment if this is good or bad. I'm just saying this was the only case where there was actually a debate about this link between foreign policy and terrorism. Then a few pictures from the 2 anniversaries from Berlin and Manchester before I end with some final conclusions. So this is from the first anniversary, and you saw that there was this ceremony in the church on Breitscheidplatz, but very much a clear role for the pastor. So Merkel was there and some politicians were there, but it wasn't a very political day. There were no political speeches. It was really more about the local community and this local pastor who said, I kind of stepped into this vacuum because the authorities were not really organizing so much for the victims and the people of Berlin. Also, by the way, in the direct aftermath. That day there was a continuous flow of people. Maybe I didn't say this, but I was there at the first anniversaries of these 4 attacks to also talk to people and see what was going on. So I was also in the church holding this candle about peaceful coexistence. But while I was there, I heard a lot of noise outside, the people shouting and sirens or people blowing horns and so on. So while the official commemoration was going on, there were 4 protests going on at the same time outside, ranging from extreme left, Antifa, to extreme right-wing, the NPD, also general demonstrations for solidarity. So you see that all these groups try to use this moment to influence the meaning-making process and share their own narrative about what they think was the right response. The picture on the bottom left, right corner, is an alternative memorial that was launched by the Identitaire Bewegung in front of Brandenburger Tor, where they put this monument that said for the victims of Islamist terrorism. Because the official monument next to the church said for the victims of terrorism, and said, no, it has to be Islamist terrorism. So you see that they all use this moment to come up with their own interpretations. Well, then Manchester, very different. If you look at the pictures, also because of the weather, of course, but it looked more like a festival day or festivity. A lot of cooperation between it wasn't, by the way, a festivity, but there was a lot of engagement by people, volunteers, people all wearing these yellow T-shirts. And really they tried to bring in the different communities and work together to put on, for instance, put these remembrance trees on the streets. The mayor walking around very visibly, shaking hands. And it was very much about this pride, about a feeling of pride and resilience of the city. And all these local symbols, so the color yellow, also the color of the Manchester bee that a lot of people had tattooed on their bodies. I love Manchester, so they really tried to emphasize these local elements of the city. And in the evening there was kind of a festival atmosphere with this One Love Manchester sing-along concert. So very different examples. And now fast forward to the main findings, which are based, of course, on the 4 cases. What I noticed is that in all these cases, terrorists were actually quite quickly pushed off the stage, so to say. So I used the theater metaphor, but quite quickly the attention was not going to the terrorists anymore, but to any other kind of thing. And not only positive, sometimes it was blame games. It wasn't only solidarity and people holding hands and so on, but it wasn't about the terrorists. Another finding was that actually the authorities were more susceptible in following the frames and following the rhetoric of the terrorists than citizens did. And I found this quite shocking because authorities usually think citizens have to be managed and they might panic and might be polarized. But it was actually authorities that were more susceptible in the cases that I studied, at least, in doing this, rather than citizens who more often called for restraint. Well, the last one I mentioned a few times, debates often also transformed quite quickly into blame games between the authorities. Second slide, before I come to my last slide, is the importance of spotlight moments and prime locations. So spotlight moments like the anniversary, where you really see that all these groups try to influence the meaning-making process, because they knew the cameras were there. This was the moment where it would be influenced, so they used this. And also symbolic locations. And one of the arguments that I try to make in this book is that terrorists often attack the public space when it comes to soft targets. Not all groups, but in many cases we see attacks on the public space, on soft targets. And you see that citizens kind of want to reclaim that public space back from the terrorists again. So these pictures are from 2 other attacks, like the London 2005 and Barcelona attacks. But you see that across all cases, that citizens want to kind of reclaim that from the terrorists. So that brings me to my final slide. So lessons for CT and crisis management. So one of the lessons that I only briefly touched upon, but that I noticed at least in 3 of the 4 cases, that authorities still don't pay so much attention, or maybe they do, but they don't know how to do it right, to the symbolic aspects of meaning making. So they still see it really as an operational issue. Find the terrorists, catch them, prosecute them, secure locations, but they don't think so much about the victims or how things look or the symbols that they use. So we all know this is part of it, but in the cases that I studied, I still saw so many examples where they didn't do that right, if I may give a normative judgment on that, which we always have to be careful as academics, of course. Secondly, facilitate and encourage the resilience of communities, because people want to do something in response. Think of the example of the hooligans, and if you don't think about the smart way to do it, they will do it in a way you don't want them to do it. So think about how to use that potential and facilitate it, because they will do it anyway. So think about how you could better use that potential also of people calling for restraint, solidarity, and resilience, and how to enable those communities. Because I would say counterterrorism has 2 pillars. It's countering the terrorists, it's stopping people from perpetrating attacks, it's preventing terrorism from occurring, or tackling root causes if something like that exists, but it's also countering that mechanism of responses, of overreaction, of being polarized. And the good news is, well, countering the terrorists is for professionals, but countering the mechanism of terrorism is something that we all can do, and especially citizens, communities can play a key role in that. And I want to end with a question. I started with the line that terrorism is violent communication, which was, by the way, Alex Smith is sitting here. He was one of the first who wrote that down, so great. And I also am looking forward to your comments. If we look at the fact that terrorists were quite quickly pushed off stage. So they get attention in the beginning, but quite quickly the debate is about something else. So what does it tell us about how successful terrorism is as a communication strategy? So on that note, and thank you for giving me 2 extra minutes, I want to thank you. And if you want to stay informed, you can scan the QR code. So thanks so much.